Friends and fellow citizens, the period for a new election of a citizen to administer the executive government of the United States being not far distant, and the time actually arrived when your thoughts must be employed in designating the person who is to be clothed with that important trust. It appears to me proper, especially as it may conduce to a more distant expression of the public voice, that I should now apprise you of the resolution I have formed to decline being considered among the number of those out of whom a choice is to be made. I beg you, at the same time, to do me the justice to be assured that this resolution has not been taken without a strict regard to all the considerations appertaining to the relation which binds a dutiful citizen to his country, and that in withdrawing the tender of service, which silence in many situation might imply, I am influenced by no diminution of zeal for your future interest, no deficiency of grateful respect for your past kindness, but am supported by a full conviction that the step is compatible with both. This is the opening statement of George Washington's farewell address. We are starting a new journey today. A journey that we're going to begin by looking at the founders of our nation. The reason we're going on this journey is as people try to tear down the history of our country, it is important to know why those people are there. Why are those statues there? Why is a city named after George Washington? Why is schools named after somebody? Why is Thomas Jefferson's name on something? It's important to know why they're there. It's also important to know what the spiritual walk of many of the historical figures of our nation was. Many try to say that they were not Christian or had any spiritual nature whatsoever. But it's important for us to understand these things as Americans and as Christians. And knowing these things about them can encourage us in our own walk with Christ. And so we begin with the most obvious one, and we'll get to, through the process of this, we'll do several of our founders, and we'll get into several of our founding documents. And we may occasionally touch on current events that would tie into this series. But we're going to start with the obvious one, George Washington, and the one considered by many to be the father of our nation. Many think they know about him from what they're told in the media. They think they know about him from what they see on Facebook, and they remember a little bit from their history class 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Unfortunately, today, not many schools teach history anymore. But we're going to see something different than what most people know about him. And I'm going to give this caveat to you. There was no way in a 15-minute-ish little talk here that I could cover the man's life and cover it properly. So I'm kind of skimming the surface here, but you'll get the idea, and I'll give you some resources at the end. But we're going to see something a little bit different than you might think when we actually look at his life, and we'll see some encouragement and some challenges for our walk with Christ. So who was this guy? Who was George Washington? Well, let's do the quick bio rundown, okay? He was born on the Pope's Creek plantation in Virginia in 1732. If some of you think you're old, that's really old, right? His family moved from there when he was 3 years old. He lost his father. His dad died when he was 11. And because of his dad dying, see, his older siblings, he had a couple of half-brothers, a couple other older siblings that received a classical Latin education. But because his father died, he lost that formal education. And so all that has been found is that he probably had a couple of private tutors and possibly attended a local school in Fredericksburg, Virginia, where he received most of his formal education, where he studied reading, writing, basic legal forms, geometry, and trigonometry. And the reason for that was it was to prepare for his first career as a surveyor. He did a lot of his own education beyond that. He read extensively. And we'll get into a little bit more of that here later. But he oftentimes is thought of, and a lot of these guys are thought of as being lived this charmed life, that everything was just perfect. Hey, you're these heroes of America. And we'll get into more of the impact when we look at the Declaration of Independence, where we see what they were willing to sacrifice for this nation. But George Washington, outside of that, faced a lot of difficulties. It was a difficult thing when he lost his dad. If any of you ever lost a parent, you know how hard that is. And it doesn't matter if your parent was 95 or 25, it was still a difficult thing. And so he not only went through the emotional loss of his father and the loss that he would have in those interactions right as he was getting ready to become a teenager, but the loss of the education and the guidance he needed for his life. And because of that loss, he struggled. One of his other difficulties was he struggled with feeling inferior to others. He didn't have the education that many of these others had. He felt inferior to the other founding fathers that we think of. You think of John Adams, Sam Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and others who most of them spoke multiple languages, including Greek and Latin. If you've ever studied any Greek and Latin, you understand that those are not piece of cake languages to know. Most of them had degrees from what we would think would be the elite schools of today, but many Ivy League schools. Some of them had multiple degrees, were incredible authors and all these other things. And so he always felt inferior because he didn't speak other languages. He didn't have that education. He didn't have a college degree. But he also struggled with something else. He struggled with his appearance. And you might think it was George Washington. Well, there was the side that there was George Washington who was tall. So most estimations was he was probably about 6'2", 6'3". And at the time, that was an enormous giant of a man. And that he was well built. He was even referenced by one guy to be considered like Saul, King Saul, in the Old Testament, who stood head and shoulders above the rest. And so he did have that, but he also struggled with something else. He had bad teeth. Now, maybe you remember, people talking about George Washington had wooden teeth. Well, he had a lot of different types of teeth because by the time he was sworn in as president, he only had one original tooth left. Well, he had a lot of different dentures at the time, and dentures in the 1700s were not like dentures today. They were incredibly bulky, difficult to speak with, difficult to wear. They really were just to be able to chew food and survive. And so that issue caused him to be what many historians think an unintended introvert. That he wasn't necessarily an introvert by nature, but that because he was so aware of his teeth, he became one. But even with these difficulties that he faced in his life, none of them changed his character. None of them changed his desire to do what he was called to do. He had a specific mission, and I think he knew what that was, and God laid that out for him. These early events led to his character as a man. And while the story of him chopping down a cherry tree and saying, I must admit that I told a lie, I chopped it down, it from most accounts that I could find, it's false. It's not a true story. But it was, in case you're curious, it was written by a guy who wrote about George Washington's life several years after he died. And that most historians think he just made the story up. But the story itself did summarize Washington's character. He was known throughout the colonies for really two things. By the time the Revolution came around, George Washington was well known in the colonies, and it was for two things. One, his prowess as a soldier. The stories were around. If you read, there's a video by Barton, historian, who talks about the bulletproof George Washington, where he was in a battle in the French and Indian War, where he had multiple horses shot out from underneath him. He had bullet holes in his coat, and a chief that was fighting with the French at the time later admitted that he finally reached the point that after several of his warriors had targeted Washington specifically as he was on his horse, and you think about that, he's a 6'3" guy, so he already stood out. They were targeting officers of the army, and Washington had multiple things. He even was pulling bullet fragments out of places, and yet he didn't have a scratch on him. So these stories were out. So his prowess as a soldier was known, but also he was known for his conduct and character. See, early on in his life, he wrote something a lot of people don't know about. He wrote what's called George Washington's Rules of Civility. And he did a bunch of research, and in it has 54 rules that he lived by, and he encouraged others to live by. And it was interesting. I came across this. I have a big, thick book about the documents of our nation, and this is in there. And it's things that a lot of people could use today. So if you're curious about it, I encourage you to Google George Washington's Rules of Civility, because he really got into how should we treat other people. And you can see Christ's command, which we'll talk about later, coming into play in it. And these rules were important to him, important throughout his life, and they bore out who was important in his life. There are a lot of people, this leads us to our big discussion with Washington today, that there are arguments used against him in many of the founding fathers, that he wasn't a Christian, and that he didn't live a life of one. He was a slave owner, so he couldn't be a Christian. He couldn't follow God. The Bible couldn't be important to him. That's a much longer discussion on a different time. Some historians try to remove it completely, saying he was irreligious or an agnostic, but they're not looking at the facts. And that is where we come to the idea of revisionist history. The truth is much farther from that. In fact, any of that could not be any further from the truth. We know this, but we have several sources. I'll just give you a couple. O eternal and everlasting God, I presume to present myself this morning before thy divine majesty, beseeching thee to accept of my humble and hearty thanks that it hath pleased thy great goodness to keep and preserve me the night past from all the dangers poor mortals are subject to, and has given me sweet and pleasant sleep, whereby I find my body refreshed and comforted for performing the duties of this day, in which I beseech thee to defend me from all perils of body and soul. Direct my thoughts, words, and work. Wash away my sins in the immaculate blood of the Lamb, and purge my heart by the Holy Spirit from the dross of my natural corruption, that I may with more freedom of mind and liberty of will serve thee, the everlasting God, in righteousness and holiness this day, and all the days of my life. Our first source is the prayer journal of George Washington. It continues on. That is just the first couple paragraphs of Monday morning. And it goes on for quite a few more paragraphs. He wrote out his journal. And that happened every morning and every evening of his life, 7 days a week, that he spent time to speak to God. In the process of looking at these prayers, you see a man who is devoted to Christ, a man who understands his need for the amazing work of the cross, the grace we have through what Jesus Christ did on that cross and his sacrifice, and a man who continually sought God throughout the day. The other source we look at is, and this is how you work history in case you really want to work history, you look at the person's own writings and you look at what other people wrote about them. Well, historian Jared Sparks published the writings of George Washington in the 1830s. And in volume 12, there were 12 volumes that he wrote of the writings of George Washington. He delved into the religious character of Washington. And in that, he included numerous letters and writings from friends, family, and associates that all attested to his religious character, how his life bore out the impact of Christ on him each and every day, and in every interaction there was fruit. People saw the fruit of Jesus Christ in George Washington's life. This doesn't mean that he was perfect. It doesn't mean that he didn't make mistakes, but it does mean that people saw Jesus Christ in his life. Our life is to reflect Christ. Matthew 22, verse 37 to 39, is Christ giving us really the greatest commandment, and that's to love God with all that we have and to love our neighbor as ourselves. People will see this exposed in our lives when we seek to fulfill it. Washington's life fulfilled it. They saw it exposed. They saw it in his life. And they saw it because of something simple yet incredibly profound. His prayer life. Him seeking God's hand multiple times every day. Being led by God constantly. You see that in a man who, in his farewell address, basically laid out the principles of why a president should not serve more than 2 terms, which didn't end until Roosevelt ran for his 3rd term in 1940, and his 4th term in 1944. Roosevelt deemed to be king, side note. But Washington set that precedence, and you can see that in his address, and that it was God leading him. And so to live out Christ's command, we need to seek him incessantly. When I thought about that idea, I thought of the widow and the judge in Luke chapter 18, where this widow continually goes to the judge, an inscrutable judge, really, and pesters him to get justice, and pesters. And the judge doesn't side with her because of who she was or that he felt justice needed to be served. He sided with her so she would leave him alone. But what that is also about, it's about justice and how justice comes about and how God would bring justice if even this imperfect judge would bring it about. But it's also about persistence in seeking God, seeking him constantly. Washington sought him morning and night, and probably many times throughout the day as he went about his day. When we seek him, Christ will be glorified and people will come to him. And that's the point to our life as a Christian. That's the point to our existence as a church, is for people to see Christ and come to him. Well, that's my covering of George Washington today. If you'd like more information on him from a Christian perspective, don't go to Harvard and Yale and those other resources. They're not going to have any of this stuff. But a good resource I found was wallbuilders.com, where they have quite a few resources to look at. They have writings of Washington and other things. If you'd like to read Washington's prayer journal, which I highly encourage you to read, you can Google it, and then you look for the CBN, Charlie Bravo, whatever N would be. I don't know. Sorry, it's, look for that. So it's Christian Broadcasting Network, cbn.com link, and they have his prayer journal written out. You can read the entire week's worth, and they're really worth reading. But remember that it is an example and a challenge for us to live our life for Christ so that people see it. But we need to seek God each and every day consistently so that he can work through us. So I just want to leave you with, be blessed, be a blessing. God loves you.